"You're not in the will, Mother. Please don't make this harder." Caleb's voice was cold and decisive, as if he were speaking to a distant employee, not the woman who had given birth to him. I stood at the threshold of the conference room, my hand still gripping the navy blue folder like a shield, while my two sons, Caleb and Miles, stood blocking the empty chair at the head of the table. The meeting room at Harrington and Bell felt formally cold, high ceilings, burgundy velvet drapes, and an oak table polished enough to reflect the rigid lines of my face. The scent of wood wax and black coffee mixed in the air, making my throat sting. "Immediate family only," Miles added, avoiding my eyes. Immediate family. Those two words echoed like a lock turning. I looked at the two men I once carried in my arms, now standing there as gatekeepers. I had thought that at my age, nothing could make me feel suffocated anymore, but in that moment, I was wrong. I took a long breath, letting the cold air fill my chest, and stepped fully into the room. Every other face, the junior lawyer, a few distant relatives, and the young secretary with a name tag that read A. Keating turned toward me with cautious eyes, as if my presence itself were a mistake. "I received an invitation," I said quietly but clearly, "from Harrington and Bell." "Correct date, correct address." Caleb let out a short, derisive laugh. "They must have sent it by mistake." I opened my folder and placed the envelope with the Harrington and Bell seal on the table. No one looked down. I continued, keeping my voice even. "B wanted me here." "Aunt B left a new will last fall," Miles replied, trying to sound gentle. "We've been appointed to handle it." "She didn't have children, boys," I reminded him, "and I am her only sister." No one answered. I could feel every second of silence pressing against my chest like a stone. Secretary Keating glanced down at the table, her finger tapping the edge of a file before whispering, "Your name isn't on today's reading list." I nodded and smiled faintly. "I know, but I didn't come here to cause a scene." I reached into the folder and took out a neatly clipped stack of papers, the first page stamped with a faint notary mark, and handed it to her. "Please give this to Mr. Sutton. I believe it will clarify things." She hesitated, then rose to take it and hurried toward the inner door. Caleb started to speak, but Miles placed a hand on his shoulder and murmured, "Wait." I sat down in the chair they had been blocking, the folder now resting on my lap not as a shield, but as evidence. I wasn't trembling anymore. I didn't need anyone's permission. All I felt was a strange calm rising inside me, the calm of someone who has nothing left to fear. When the door opened again, Mr. Sutton entered, tall, gray, bearded, his coat dusted with paper fibers as if he had just stepped out of an old book. He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Whitaker, may I speak with you privately?" Caleb frowned. "This meeting is for family only." Mr. Sutton turned to him, his voice steady. "And I think we're about to find out who truly counts as family." No one spoke. I stood, straightened my collar, and followed him into the adjoining room, where the door closed softly behind us like the period ending an old chapter. I didn't know where things would turn next, but one thing I was certain of: today, I would not be pushed away from my own seat again. If this story reminds you of a time you were shut out of the place that should have been yours, leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to catch the next journey of Begin Again stories. You are not alone. The inner room was smaller than I'd expected, with only a chest-high counter, no chairs and no windows. It was filled with the faint scent of cedarwood, mixed with the smell of old paper and printer ink. Mr. Sutton closed the door behind him and turned toward me, his eyes both stern and quiet. "I didn't think I'd see you here today, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice soft yet heavy like a verdict. I placed the folder on the counter, keeping my hand on its cover without opening it. "I'm only doing what B asked of me," I replied. He nodded, pulling out the stack of papers Miss Keating had just brought in, unfolding each page carefully. I could hear the soft rustle of paper, the ticking of the wall clock counting evenly, like it was measuring the beats of all the waiting I had ever done in my life. He stopped at the third page, glasses slipping slightly down his nose. "Do you know what this document is?" "I do," I said, my voice sounding almost foreign to my own ears. "It's the mutual will that B and I signed in 2011. notarized with 2 witnesses, filed at the Chatham County office. He rested his hand on the corner of the page and nodded slightly. "Correct. And the important thing is," he looked up directly at me, "it was never revoked, at least not in your presence." I shook my head. "No, she never mentioned canceling it. Even in her final years, when her memory flickered, B still remembered signing it with me. She called it our sister's covenant, said it was how we'd make trust live longer than we did." Mr. Sutton set the paper down, clasping his hands before him, speaking slowly. "Legally, that means any subsequent revisions, including the one your son submitted, are void unless both original signatories were present and consenting, and in this case, they were not." I felt my chest grow heavy, not because of the inheritance mentioned, but because of the 2 words he had just said. They were not. Mr. Sutton continued, "Therefore, by law, you are the sole heir to the entire estate, the historic house on Forsyth Park, the cottage on Tybee Island, and all investment and savings accounts. The preliminary valuation totals approximately $1.2 million. I heard the number as though it were spoken in a foreign language. It didn't make me feel richer, only emptier. B was truly gone, and what remained were papers, numbers, and people counting them. Mr. W. Tim. Sutton paused before asking, "Would you like me to inform the others of this now?" I glanced toward the half-closed wooden door. Beyond it, Caleb was probably standing with his arms crossed while Miles pretended to stay calm. I drew a slow breath. "No, let them hear it with everyone else. I want them to know not from my mouth but from the truth itself." Mr. Sutton was silent for a moment, his expression softening, as if he understood something beyond the legal realm. "I worked with B for years," he said quietly. "She always believed in fairness, but she used to say fairness without witnesses could easily be twisted. Today, I think you're the last witness to that trust." I smiled faintly, though what I felt wasn't joy, it was release. I had carried that folder all this way, not just to hold documents but to hold a promise. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton," I said softly. He nodded. "When you return to the conference room, I'll read the will. They may react. Let me handle the law. All you need to do is stay silent. Sometimes the silence of the right one makes the wrong hear their own noise." I nodded, closing the folder. The latch clicked softly, the sound echoing through the narrow space like a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter. When I stepped out, the air in the conference room felt colder, but my hands no longer trembled. Caleb looked up, his eyes flickering between suspicion and fear. Miles stared down, tapping his fingers on the edge of his chair. I walked to my seat and sat down, right where they had once blocked me. This time, I didn't ask permission, and I didn't explain. I simply sat, back straight, calm, waiting for Mr. Sutton to step out with the document in hand. A new chapter of my life had just begun, not with a bell, but with one simple sentence. By law, Mrs. Elaine Whitaker is the sole heir. If you've ever stood outside the door of a room where you should have had a seat, remember this. Sometimes all it takes is one rightful signature, one steadfast moment, to reclaim everything that was taken from you. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next journey of Begin Again stories. You are not late, and you are not alone. When I returned home that afternoon, the Savannah sky had turned the color of pale copper, sunlight spilling unevenly across the old stone sidewalk. I opened the door, the hinge creaked softly, and the house still held its familiar scent of camphor oil, waffles, and dry oak. The scent of time itself, something only those who've lived long enough can recognize. I hung my coat, set the navy folder on the dining table, and stood still for a long while. The kettle was still where it had always been. The light above the sink flickered, the bulb having needed replacement for 2 months now, a small thing I hadn't bothered to fix. I turned on the stove, poured water, and listened to it boil. The sound of steam hitting the lid was like the heartbeat of the house. Old habits, even when there's no one left to share tea with. The faint aroma of black leaves pulled the memories back. I still remember that winter morning 23 years ago, the day Derek, my husband, left. It was a foggy morning when I heard the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. I ran in to find him collapsed, his hand still holding the dish towel. His heart had stopped before the ambulance arrived. When they covered him with the white sheet, I was still holding the phone, unsure who to call first. Randall and Trevor. No, Caleb and Miles stood beside me, wide-eyed like lost boys. Caleb was 20, Miles 18. They didn't speak for a week. In the second week, they began discussing insurance, the car, and the mortgage, much like apprentices rehearsing for adulthood. I thought it was their way of coping, so I let it be. I did everything. I filled out the forms, arranged the funeral, and sold the boat that Derek had promised to repaint. I still remember signing the transfer papers, my hand shaking so badly that it tore the corner of the page. The young clerk smiled and said, "Your husband would be proud of how strong you are." I smiled back, but in my head I thought, no, he'd be sad that I learned to be strong too quickly. After the funeral, life felt like a spool of thread yanked straight, no room left for knots or softness. Caleb dropped out of college to become a broker, saying he wanted to help me get stable sooner. Miles took a job at a mechanic shop with an old friend, saying he liked working with his hands. I told myself, as long as they lived decently, I could endure anything. But year after year, I found myself becoming just a spectator in their lives. I helped Caleb when he lost money in his first deal, wrote him a check from my newly received pension. He promised to repay me but never mentioned it again. I helped Miles when his business partner ran off with all the garage funds, withdrew from my savings so that he wouldn't go bankrupt. No questions, no conditions, just a mother's reflex. Each time I told myself, consider it an investment in your children's happiness. I never knew if happiness pays dividends, only that the more I gave, the quieter the house became. Dinner for 4 became dinner for 2, then for 1. Time taught me how to be silent, how not to expect anyone to ask, "Are you okay, Mom?" Then one February day, B called, her voice trembling. "I forgot the code to the bank safe. Do you remember it?" I froze. B, the woman who could recite every date, every cent, every number, could no longer remember 4 familiar digits. I drove 40 minutes to her house and found her medicine cabinet in the fridge, her indoor shoes sitting on the kitchen table. "You must be worried," she laughed. "I'm just a little tired." But 2 months later, the doctor said, "Early-stage cognitive decline." I suggested she move in with me. B refused, saying she wasn't ready to live like someone being taken care of. But after the 3rd time she forgot to turn off the gas stove, I knew I had no choice. I prepared the room by the back garden, hung Derek's old painting on the wall, and placed a vase of lavender by the bed. "I won't be any trouble," she said as she moved in. "Just give me a quiet corner." I smiled. This house has never been quiet. I thought I was joking, but later it became true in reverse. The house grew quiet, frighteningly so. I woke early, brewed tea for 2, read the paper, then heard B ask, "What day is it today?" I'd answer Wednesday. 5 minutes later, she'd ask again, "What day is it?" Each time I replied in the same gentle tone. I didn't count the repetitions. I only counted the look in her eyes when she realized she'd forgotten something again. It was so sorrowful that even my sighs went silent. Caleb and Miles visited a few times, each stay lasting a couple of hours. "Mom, don't wear yourself out," Miles said. "Aunt B isn't your responsibility." I just smiled, saying nothing. Some things aren't responsibilities, they're meanings. When B grew weaker, I slept beside her bed, afraid she might wander off at night. One rainy night, I found her sitting on the porch, hair wet, saying she was waiting for our father to come home. I wrapped a towel around her shoulders, and she looked at me for a long time before asking, "Are you my neighbor?" I smiled. "No, I'm the one who makes your tea every morning." B looked out at the garden. Good, the one who makes tea should inherit the flowers. I didn't understand then, but I remembered it. Years later, when I opened the Navy envelope, I realized she had written that very line into her will. When B passed away, the house was so quiet that I could hear the ticking clock. I sat by her bed, holding her hand for 2 hours before calling anyone, not out of shock, but to keep my final promise, to let her leave gently, without haste, without sirens, without antiseptic smells, only the scent of lavender, the morning light, and me. I held a small funeral, and a few neighbors came. Caleb read a eulogy like reading an email. Miles stood with his hands in his pockets, head down. They didn't cry, neither did I. But after the service, they began asking about assets, about paperwork. I let them handle it, thinking everything was already clear. It wasn't until Caleb's call last week, "You don't need to come to the reading, Mom. Everything's been taken care of," that I understood sometimes people don't steal from you with a gun, but with the certainty that you won't dare to object. I sat in the kitchen, my hand brushing against the navy envelope. It had been there for 12 years, never reopened, always waiting for this day. I didn't bring it to prove I was right, but to keep my promise to be, if they forget who I am, remind them who you are. And that's exactly what I did. If you've ever given so much of your life to others that you forgot yourself, remember this: it's never too late to pour a cup of tea for yourself again. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next journey of Begin Again stories. Because some lives only truly begin when we stop giving everything away without keeping anything for ourselves. The main conference room at Harrington and Bell was eerily silent. Afternoon light streamed through the red velvet drapes, casting a dying flame across the long oak table. Everyone had taken their seats. My chair still bore the faint imprint of my hand right at the head of the table, the same seat I had been blocked from that morning. The navy folder rested in my lap, no longer a shield. It felt like a key now, and I knew once the door opened, nothing would ever be the same. Mr. Sutton stood at the head of the table, glasses slipping slightly down his nose, his voice steady and low. "The reading of Mrs. Beatrice Rowan's will shall commence. The estate includes 2 properties, various investments, and savings accounts in Chatham County." He opened a stack of papers and glanced at Caleb and Miles, his expression unreadable. "The will submitted by both of you last September has been determined to be a unilateral revision and carries no legal validity. According to the records held by the county office, the most legally binding document is the mutual will from 2011, signed by Mrs. Beatrice Rowan and Mrs. Elaine Whitaker, which states that each party shall be the lawful heir of the other unless revoked in the presence of both." A silence fell over the room like a heavy cloth. Caleb raised an eyebrow and gave a short, dry laugh. "That can't be right. We submitted the latest notarized update." Mr. Sutton looked up. "I understand. However, the law does not rely on what is the latest, but rather on what is valid. And that one, sir, is not valid." Miles exhaled sharply while I remained still, my hands clasped together, listening to my heartbeat sync with the sound of paper turning. "According to the 2011 document," Mr. Sutton continued, "the entire estate, including the residence on Forsyth Park, the cottage on Tybee Island, and all investment accounts, totaling $1.2 million, is to be lawfully transferred to Mrs. Elaine Whitaker." The words rang out clear, concise, slicing through the air like a sharp blade. No one spoke. I heard a chair scrape, and someone swallowed hard. Caleb stared at me, his face frozen, as if he'd just heard a bad joke. Miles lowered his head, his hands clenched tight. Mr. Sutton folded the papers, his tone calm. "Any objections, if there are any, must be filed with the county court within 30 days. However, please note that this will is notarized, filed, and verified by the same legal office that certified the public copy in 2011. Any documents submitted afterward are considered invalid." I sat quietly, my eyes fixed on the window. Sunlight spilled across the wooden frame, painting golden streaks on the floor like the slow breathing of the room itself. I heard Caleb's low voice, tight with anger. "What is this, Mother? How long have you known?" I looked at him calmly. "Long enough not to be afraid anymore." Miles spoke next, his voice rough. "So, it all belongs to you?" "No, Miles," I said softly. "It belongs to the sister I cared for until her last breath. I'm just keeping her promise." The air thickened, and the looks turned toward me no longer dismissive but cautious. I said nothing more. "Mr. Sutton concluded, therefore, according to the terms of the will, full legal ownership of the estate is hereby transferred to Mrs. Elaine Whitaker. I will proceed with the necessary filings." He nodded slightly and stepped out of the room. I rose slowly. The chair I had once been blocked from now stood empty, its worn leather still warm from my touch. I brushed my fingers lightly along its back before turning away. Behind me, I heard Caleb whisper hoarsely, "You planned this all along, didn't you?" I didn't answer. Some questions are meant for the wind. As I stepped into the hallway, the last light of day streamed through the stained glass, bathing everything in a muted golden hue. I paused for a moment, seeing my reflection on the floor, not bent, but upright and clear. I knew at that moment the balance of power in that room had shifted. No one could ever again tell me I didn't belong there. They could keep their money and their excuses, but I held something greater. The truth. I walked outside, the Savannah breeze carrying the salty air from Tybee Island, cool and liberating. I gripped the handle of my folder, and for the first time in years, I felt that what I carried was not a burden, but proof of a life lived right. If you've ever been dismissed, ever pushed out of your own story, remember this. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with applause, but in the quiet moment when you sit in the chair they once said wasn't yours. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories, because emotional justice begins the moment you stop bowing your head. That night, I couldn't sleep. Everything in the house was so silent, I could almost hear the clock's ticking pulse moving through my veins. I sat by the window, moonlight slipping through the magnolia branches outside, scattering pale patches of light across the wooden floor. On the table lay B's old poetry book, Collected Whispers, the spine worn, a few pages still held together with paper clips I'd never removed. On page 47, a faint underline marked a line she once loved, "Blood is memory, not possession." I read it again and again, hearing B's voice echo beside me. We were born 11 months apart, close enough that our mother used to joke we were 2 springs in 1 year. B was radiant. I was quiet. She loved loud music, parties, and movement. I loved the small kitchen, mornings with tea, and the hum of the local radio. As girls, B often skipped school, dragging me along, saying, "Sitting in class is a waste of youth." I'd sit beside her later, helping her copy her notes before class, afraid the teacher would scold her. We were opposites, but somehow, we needed each other to stay balanced. After our parents died in a federal accident, we only had each other left. B had just turned 18. I was 19. 2 girls, 1 old house, and too many unpaid bills. I still remember that first night we slept on the living room floor, surrounded by stacks of insurance papers. B turned to me and said, "You'll plan, I'll speak, we'll be fine." And we were, though it was never easy. I became a teacher at the elementary school. B took night classes, worked as a secretary, and later joined the local radio. She always said, "If you have a voice, you have the right to tell your story." Perhaps that's why she never let anyone speak on her behalf. I still remember the summer of 1979, when she sent me her first postcard from Greece. In her careful handwriting, "The sky is as blue as your voice when you teach the children the letter A." Every one of B's trips brought back something strange, a tiny bell bracelet, a heart-shaped stone, or a jar of pickled onions from Dublin. "So the house has some sound," she'd say. "Too much quiet is death in disguise." When Derek proposed to me, B laughed and said, "You'll have a home and I'll have the world." I told her, "Your world will be lonely." She replied, "Loneliness isn't scary. Losing freedom is." It took me years to realize she was right. When B moved in with me after her cognitive diagnosis, I was terrified that everything would collapse between 2 opposite women who'd lived apart for nearly 2 decades, now sharing one roof. But strangely, the house felt fuller. B still smelled of her old Guerlain perfume, still mumbled bits of poetry in the kitchen. Some mornings I brewed tea while she sat by the window, doodling on napkins, circles, flowers, and small words, scrawled in her shaky hand. "Don't let anyone rewrite your ending, May." She still called me May, the name only she ever used since childhood. As her memory faded, those words remained. One evening, as I brushed her hair, B looked at me through the mirror and spoke slowly, each word etched into the air. When I'm no longer clear-headed, don't let anyone speak in my name to undo what I've chosen. People forget their promises when money is involved, May. Remember, loyalty needs a signature too. I said nothing, only held her hand. That was the last time B was lucid enough to give advice. From then on, every time I signed a document, I wrote slowly, as if signing for both of us. Last spring, B's final one, I took her to sit in the garden. The lavender was in bloom. B looked up at the sky and smiled, faint but bright. If I forget everything, she said, remind me with the scent of flowers. I don't need to remember it all, just who I trusted. I smiled through tears. And when she passed, I placed a small lavender bouquet in her hand, along with a short note that read, I still remember. The story of the two sisters didn't end with death but with her final request, a promise not to let anyone steal another person's faith. That's why I sit here today, late in life, defending not an inheritance but a bond between two women once seen as fragile, but who loved in the strongest way possible, by keeping a promise. I closed the poetry book and turned off the lamp, but before leaving the table, I wrote on a small note and stuck it beside B's framed photo. The one who makes the tea will always inherit the flowers. If there's someone in your life who taught you what trust really means, send them a message, whether they're here or gone. And if this story touched you, leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next journey of Begin Again stories. Because sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't locked in a safe. It lives in the final words of someone who loved you. The next morning, light rain fell over the savannah sky, raindrops sliding down the window frame like trembling lines of handwriting from a fading memory. I sat in Mr. Sutton's law office holding a cup of hot black coffee, the steam blurring half my reflection in the glass. Across from me, he was reviewing each page with his silver fountain pen, slow and steady, the kind of man who didn't need many words to inspire trust. Which clause would you like to start with? He asked, his voice even as the sound of rain. I answered without hesitation. I want to lock the doors, both literally and legally. He raised an eyebrow. Lock the doors? Legally, I said. I want to make sure no one but me can touch this estate. Not Caleb, not Miles, not through power of attorney, not through some temporary management title, not through a polite smile. Mister? Sutton gave a faint, knowing smile. We can establish a restricted access clause, he said. Any individual or representative not explicitly authorized will be denied access to accounts, files, or any fixed assets. Violation will result in civil action. He paused, his eyes firm. Are you certain? I nodded. I've handed out the keys to my life for too long. It's time I kept one for myself. I looked down at the table, the stack of papers spread out like a map, each line a road leading toward late-found freedom. And I want to create a trust, I added, a living one, not for my sons, but for someone who still understands what family means. Mr. Sutton flipped open his notebook, jotting notes. The beneficiary's name? Clara Whitlow, I said, smiling faintly. My cousin's granddaughter. She's 27, works at the city library, and visits me every 2 weeks. Never asks about money, just brings lemon cakes and time. He nodded. I'll prepare the clause. A portion of the estate or all of it? Just enough, I replied. Enough so she never has to choose between her dreams and the rent. Enough to remind the next generation that kindness still holds value. As he typed, the sound of the keys blended with the rain outside, forming a steady rhythm like the ticking of a clock beginning again. And your 2 sons? He asked. I want a separate clause, I said calmly. If they attempt to contest, sue, or interfere with any part of this estate, even a single line, they forfeit every right to anything I leave behind. No warnings, no apologies. He looked at me, eyes tinged with admiration. You're asking for a no-contest clause. I nodded. Yes, because people only learn limits when they meet consequences. When everything was finalized, Mr. Sutton slid the file toward me. One last matter, he said. Would you like to name a contingent heir? In case Miss Whitlow declines or passes away before you? I was quiet for a moment, then shook my head. No, I trust she'll use it wisely. I'm not writing an escape route for trust. I signed each page, my handwriting steady, unwavering. Mr. Sutton said softly, "You know, most people sign with fear, but you sign like someone unlocking something." I smiled. Because that's exactly what I'm doing. When I left the office, the rain had stopped. I stood under the porch, breathing in the scent of damp air and pine. In my hand was the new folder, less than half an inch thick but as heavy as a lifetime of endurance. I knew my sons wouldn't stay silent for long. They would call, write, and find excuses to just talk. But this time I had boundaries written in ink, sealed by law, and locked with self-respect. That evening, sitting in my kitchen, I opened the drawer and took out Bee's old notebook. On one of the pages, she had once written, "Don't let anyone else sign for you again." I smiled, touched the faded words, and wrote beneath them, "Sister, this time, I signed for both of us." If you've ever had to learn how to lock the door that others kept pushing open, remember this: it isn't selfish, it's the beginning of peace. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some locks aren't meant to keep others out, they exist to keep yourself whole. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:04 a.m., 3 short, sharp chimes, as if he were tapping on the heartbeat of the house itself. I looked through the curtain at the black sedan parked crookedly across the driveway, headlights still on, engine running. Caleb had never known how to park straight, not even as a boy. The child who once argued with his teacher at 10 was now 35, wearing leather shoes and the confidence of someone used to being forgiven. I didn't rush to open the door. I let him wait. 1 minute, 2, 3. Then I turned the lock. "Hi, Mom," Caleb said, his smile thin as paper. "I was nearby. Thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing." "Nearby?" I asked evenly. "On your way back from the lawyer's office." He hesitated, then laughed, caught but unashamed. "You're as sharp as ever. Good thing we're not in court, you'd win." I didn't invite him in, but he stepped over the threshold anyway, as if the house still belonged to him. The faint scent of expensive cologne filled the air, the kind I could never stand because it always tried to mask something else: emptiness. He looked around, hands in his pockets, eyes gliding over each framed photo, each object, as if mentally appraising them. "The house looks the same," he said. "You've kept it nice. You know, Mom, Miles and I are just trying to make sure everything is handled reasonably. No one wants you feeling stressed at your age." I poured tea, without offering him any. "Reasonably?" I repeated. "Yes. Paperwork, assets, legal matters, they're complicated. You don't need that burden. I just want to help you avoid mistakes, ones that could cause problems for you." I set the cup down and met his eyes. Problems like filing a forged will under the name of someone deceased? He gave a soft chuckle, his tone shifting to a drizzle of smooth charm. "Mom, forged sounds harsh. We just updated a few details." The lawyer even said adjustments can be made if the family agrees. "Everything can be fixed, right?" "Yes," I said, "everything but integrity." His smile tightened. "You're misunderstanding me. I just think, after everything, you don't need to manage this big house alone. Miles is busy, and I'm far away. I just want to make sure things are used wisely. If you'd like, I can help sell some property. We could split the profit evenly. Everyone's happy." "Everyone's happy," I echoed. "Except the dead, and the one keeping their promise." Caleb tilted his head, his eyes glinting the look of someone who succeeded by twisting the truth. "Mom, we're talking about paperwork, not morality. I just don't want you caught in legal trouble. I don't want anyone taking advantage of you." I gave a small laugh. "Like when you made me sign over the house years ago?" He froze, his face tightening. "That was a long time ago. I just didn't understand then. I thought it'd make things simpler for you." "Simpler for me?" I said. "Or for you?" Silence. For a few seconds, the ticking clock on the wall sounded like a gavel. Caleb smiled again, but it was strained, stretched like an overused rubber band. "You're angry," he said. "No, Caleb," I replied. "I'm awake." He took a step back but kept his voice soft. "You don't need to be upset. If you trust me, we can settle everything. Just share the original documents with us and we'll handle the rest. You won't have to worry. And then? I asked. You'll send me monthly reports like an allowance statement? He sighed, feigning patience. You're making this bigger than it is. I'm just trying to keep the peace. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the man before me but the boy who once promised, I'll never make you sad. That promise had died the same year I signed away ownership of my first home. Do you know what you're best at, Caleb? I said slowly. Using language to make people feel wrong when you're the one who is. He froze, lips parting with no words to follow. I stood, took the cold tea, and poured it into the sink. You want to help me? Fine. Learn to be quiet. He stared at me as if he didn't recognize the woman standing before him. You're changing, he said softly. No, Caleb, I answered. I'm coming back. When he left, I watched through the window as the black sedan sped away in the rain, tire tracks marking the wet brick path. I took a deep breath, feeling the storm pass but knowing it hadn't touched me this time. At my age, I no longer needed to win every argument. I only needed to make sure no one spoke for me again. If you've ever faced someone who uses sweet words to erase their own wrongs, remember this: silence has its own volume, and sometimes it's the only sound a manipulator can hear. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some confrontations don't need shouting, just a mother who no longer trembles when she says no. The rain had stopped long ago, but the Savannah afternoon still clung to a dampness that felt like the in-between of forgiveness and caution. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard a sound on the porch. 3 knocks, not firm like Caleb's, but hesitant, awkward, as if the person outside wasn't sure whether he should be knocking at all. I pulled back the curtain. Miles. No suit, no polished car. Just an old, oil-stained jacket and soaked shoes. He stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes uncertain. I opened the door but didn't smile. Hi, Mom, he said softly. I hope I'm not intruding. That depends, I replied, stepping aside. Come in if you've brought something more real than an apology. He nodded, stepped inside, and placed his cap on the table. Steam rose from his damp shoulders in the fading light. The house was so quiet that only the ticking clock and the soft drip of water from his jacket filled the air. I made tea a habit I never dropped, even if sometimes it was just to fill the silence. When I placed the cup before him, Miles spoke gently. Mom, I didn't come about the money. I know I owe you more than that, but here. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope, placing it on the table. I opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, 11 pages, carefully lined and annotated with all the amounts I'd lent him over the past 15 years. $850 for a transmission repair. $2,000 for March rent. $50 for the tow truck that year. And at the very bottom, in his uneven handwriting, total, $14,230. Not yet repaid, but not forgotten. I looked at him. You kept track of every amount? Because I didn't want to forget, he said, still not meeting my eyes. Even if I pretended I didn't remember then. I don't have much, but I have my word. And I want to start paying it back. Little by little. I touched the corner of the paper, feeling the faint dampness of ink against my skin. I wasn't moved nor bitter, just profoundly tired. Miles, I said. What I needed was never money. He looked up, eyes glistening like the sky outside. I know, but I owe you silence too. The day you were taking care of Aunt B, I said the worst thing I've ever said, which was that it wasn't your responsibility. I want to take those words back. I said nothing. The citrus scent of the tea spread through the air, warm yet my wrist still felt cold. I know Caleb came here, he said finally. I'm not defending him. But I understand why he is the way he is. You raised us to be kind, but we never learned limits. I looked at him, saw the weariness in his hunched shoulders. He wasn't like Caleb, no performance of strength, no excuses, but he was still my son, and for years they'd shared one belief, that I would always endure. "If you really want to make things right," I said, "don't protect your brother. Don't let loyalty blind you to what's right." He nodded. "I don't want to take sides." "It's not about sides," I interrupted. "It's about character." He fell silent, then whispered, "I won't take part in the lawsuit. Caleb might call it betrayal, but I've lived long enough to know honesty isn't a crime." I nodded slightly. In the house, the ticking clock sounded steady, like the heartbeat of something coming back to life. Miles slid the envelope toward me. "I'll send it bit by bit. You don't have to count. Just know that I'm trying." I looked at him and said slowly, "Don't send it. Keep it as a reminder. Redemption isn't paid with money, but with how you live differently." He smiled faintly, not young anymore, but genuine. "I'll remember." "I know you will." When he stood, his wet shoes left faint prints on the floor. Not heavy, just soft, like the memory of someone who'd done wrong but found the courage to return. He said goodbye and stepped onto the porch just as the sun broke through. The last drops of rain glimmered like shattered glass. I watched him go, not lighter, but calmer. Some confrontations don't need shouting. They just need two people telling the truth for the first time. I placed the envelope into a drawer. Between the legal documents and B's will, 3 layers of memory, 3 kinds of responsibility, but only one key: awareness. If you've ever forgiven someone without receiving an apology, remember this. Sometimes, emotional justice isn't about who repays, but about you no longer waiting to be repaid. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some debts aren't settled with money, only with a restored heart. The morning after Miles left, Savannah returned to its familiar quiet, the kind of stillness that no longer felt frightening but more like the pause between 2 breaths. I sat at the kitchen table, the legal folders open before me, beside them the navy envelope still unsealed. I knew what was coming. Caleb never accepted defeat without making noise. And as expected, among the morning mail was a thick envelope stamped with the logo of Sterling and Doyle, the kind of envelope heavy, not with paper, but with intent. Inside was a threat wrapped in polite language. "Dear Mrs. Whitaker, our client, Mr. Caleb Whitaker, has reason to question the legal validity of the 2011 will. Please cooperate by providing the original document and any related materials to avoid entering litigation." I folded the letter and set it down, not shaking, not angry, just feeling a cold weight under my feet. Then I turned on the kettle. As the water began to boil, I picked up the phone and called Mr. Sutton. He answered on the second ring. "I just received a letter," I said. "Sterling and Doyle?" "Yes." "Don't worry," he replied calmly. "They'll try intimidation before stepping into court. I've already filed authentication for the original will, along with supporting evidence. They have no grounds to win." I hung up, but I wasn't at ease. Not because I feared losing the estate, but because I knew Caleb would try to paint Bea as mentally incompetent, and I couldn't let that happen. I stood and went to the wooden cabinet in the hallway, the one that still held the old metal box, paint-chipped but lock intact. Inside were things few people knew I'd kept: memos, handwritten letters, and a thick stack of Bea's journals spanning her final 10 years. Each volume was numbered, her handwriting slanted to the right, precise, bold, and organized. I opened the one from 2011, the year we signed the mutual will. On the first page, Bea had written, "Today, May and I did the right thing. Not for money, but for peace of mind. I want her to have a home, and I want to have a promise. We trust each other, and that's enough." I kept reading, each page like blood flowing backward to the heart. In 2015, she wrote, "My memory slips sometimes, but my feelings remain the same. If the day comes when I forget who I am, May will still remember, and I trust her more than any lawyer I've ever met." I stopped at the final entry of 2018, her handwriting trembling but clear. "If they call me weak, let my writing answer for me. I have never signed anything I didn't understand." I closed the page and sat still, listening to the wind sweep across the porch. It wasn't just a diary. It was testimony. And I knew the coming battle wasn't about money or property anymore. It was about memory, about the right to believe that the old woman they were trying to discredit had lived with clarity until her final day. I called Mr. Sutton again. "I have more evidence," I said. "B's journals." Dated, signed, in her hand. His tone deepened. "Good. We'll use her own words to answer them. Courts trust handwritten documents when they show consistency." I smiled. "They want to prove my sister was senile. But these pages prove the opposite, that only greed drives others to madness." That afternoon, I visited the print shop, requested copies of every page, laminated and numbered them, and then labeled them, "Journal of Beatrice Rowan, Evidence of Cognitive Capacity and Voluntary Intent." The girl at the counter looked up and asked softly, "Legal documents, ma'am?" I nodded. "Documents of justice." On the way home, I remembered something B once said when we were young. "They can take your words, but never your writing." She'd said that after a radio editor had cut off her broadcast mid-sentence. That day, she only smiled and said, "They turned off the mic, but I still have my pen." That evening, I spread all the copies across the table, arranging them by year, feeling as though I was setting up a battlefield, not with weapons, but with memory. I typed the preface for the new legal file. The following pages demonstrate the mental clarity, voluntary intent, and full understanding of the legal signatory. Any claim suggesting the individual lacked capacity holds no merit. Let her own words be the witness. When I typed the final line, I looked up the room, blurred under the soft light, but I could almost see B's face in the haze, smiling, nodding in approval. The next morning, I took the completed file to the post office and sent it by express delivery to the courthouse and to Mr. Sutton. In the sender's section, I signed clearly, "Elaine Whittick, our legal representative and executor of the estate of Beatrice Rowan." For the first time in years, I signed my name without trembling. Because for the first time, I wasn't representing someone else. I was defending us both. If someone has ever tried to rewrite your story for you, remember this. Sometimes the strongest form of resistance isn't shouting, it's letting your pen say what they can't deny. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some battles can only be won through memory and through the handwriting of the one who taught you what honesty means. The courtroom at Chatham County was smaller than I had imagined, none of the grandeur seen in films, just a bright wooden room with old chairs and the mingled scent of paper and stale coffee. I sat beside Mr. Sutton, my hands folded in my lap, while Caleb sat across the aisle wearing a crisp suit, hair neatly combed, his eyes still calculating but, for the first time, touched by fear. Not fear of the law, but of being seen for who he truly was. In front of us, the judge, a middle-aged woman with prematurely silver hair and eyes that allowed no deception, glanced over both sides before speaking, her voice clear and precise, like rain against glass. "We are here to determine the validity of the 2011 will sign between Mrs. Beatrice Rowan and Mrs. Elaine Whittaker. Plaintiff Mr. Caleb Whittaker, you may proceed." Caleb stood, his tone carefully measured. "Your Honor, I believe that at the time of signing this will my Aunt Mrs. Rowan was no longer of sound mind to understand her legal actions fully. We have reason to suspect undue influence from the beneficiary." Mr. Sutton said nothing, only slid a folder toward the judge, waiting for his turn. She nodded and shifted her gaze toward me. "Mrs. Whittaker, does your counsel wish to respond?" Mr. Sutton rose, his voice low and firm. "Your Honor, we have clear evidence pro. Having that, Mrs. Rowan was entirely competent at the time of signing. The proof does not come from testimony, but from her own words, her journals, handwritten letters, and notarized documents." He opened the folder, removed a copy of the journal, and read aloud, "If they say I am weak, let my writing answer. I have never signed anything I did not understand." The room fell silent. I saw the judge pause her writing, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mr. Sutton continued, "Mrs. Rowan not only understood, she anticipated this very situation. We also have a statement from her neurologist, dated the same year, confirming no signs of cognitive impairment." He handed over the certificate. The judge examined it, then turned to Caleb. "Mr. Whittaker, do you have any evidence to the contrary?" Caleb swallowed hard and pulled a few papers from his briefcase. "We have email correspondence between Mrs. Rowan and a neighbor in which she appears confused." The judge glanced at them briefly. "These messages lack signature or identity verification. Do you have anything else?" Caleb fell silent, his lips pressed tight. "No, Your Honor. There are no buts in evidence, Mr. Whitaker," she interrupted. "The court does not judge feelings, it judges facts." Mr. Sutton leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "Just breathe. We're fine." I nodded faintly, eyes fixed on the wooden table, where sunlight streamed through the window, forming a golden line like a thread stitching two generations together. When the judge said, "The court declares the 2011 will be valid. Subsequent revisions are void. All claims by the plaintiff are dismissed." I did not rejoice. I only felt a thin layer of dust lift from my heart. Caleb sank into his seat, hands clenched, eyes locked on me as if he couldn't understand why he had lost. But I didn't look back. Winning and losing no longer mattered to someone who had spent a lifetime learning to stand tall. Mr. Sutton nodded respectfully to the judge and gathered the documents. As we stepped out, the courthouse hallway was filled with light, our footsteps echoing evenly, and I thought of Bea. She would have smiled, half mocking, half proud, and said, "See, May, you won with words, not with noise." Outside, Caleb caught up to me, his voice breaking. "Mom, I didn't think it would go this far." I stopped and turned, sunlight falling across his face, the same face that had softened my heart so many times. "No, Caleb," I said slowly. "You just thought everything would always go your way. Now you know not everyone who stays silent is weak." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his eyes dropping. "So what do you want from me now, Mom?" "Nothing. I already have peace. You can keep what's left of the lesson." He lowered his head, his polished shoes reflecting the whole sky above. As he walked away, I watched the figure of my once tall son seem smaller against the wide path. The fall of a winner and a loser doesn't happen when the verdict is read. It happens when they realize for the first time that truth doesn't need their belief to exist. I stood there for a long moment, then turned toward the sunlit street. March in Savannah was beginning to bloom, white dogwoods brightening every corner, and I realized justice is never loud. It waits for those patient enough to walk past the sound of fear. If you've ever been underestimated just because you stayed quiet, remember, silence is not defeat. Sometimes it's the loudest kind of victory. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next chapter of Begin Again Stories. Because some people only truly fall when they learn that trust cannot be manipulated by words, only by character. That afternoon, sunlight poured into the kitchen like liquid honey, gentle and patient. I brewed tea, the scent of mint spreading through a house that finally felt quiet after so many stormy months. On the table lay a cream-colored envelope, thick and soft, sealed with red wax. It was not a legal document, but something I had written over 3 nights. A letter, not for the court, not for the lawyer, but for Lily. Lily wasn't my daughter by blood, but Bea's niece, the young woman I had chosen to trust, to pass on the real inheritance. Not money, but the responsibility of kindness. I wrote to Lily not as someone leaving possessions, but as a woman who had once mistaken silence for peace. I began the letter simply, "This is not a reward, it's a recognition." I told Lily that for most of my life, I thought patience meant waiting for others to understand me, that kindness meant sacrificing without expecting anything in return, and that family meant that blood ties had to come before fairness. Then I told her that all those things were only half true. I wrote, "Never let anyone tell you you have to shrink yourself to keep the peace. You have the right to say enough, even to those you love." Because sometimes, true compassion isn't about keeping things calm. It's about refusing to let wrongness continue. I remembered the first time Lily came to my house, carrying lemon cakes and a shy smile, saying, "I don't know if you like sweets, but I think everyone needs a little sourness to stay awake." I laughed. Since then, every 2 weeks she came, on time, never late, never empty-handed. While everyone else showed up because they wanted to help me organize my estate, Lily came to listen to stories about B, about the years when my sister and I had only each other and trust. Not once did she mention money, property, or being included in anything. Maybe that's why I knew she was the right one to receive what truly mattered. I wrote in the letter, "I chose you not because you're perfect, but because you came without expectation. You remind me of B, who once said, 'The one who makes the tea always deserves to inherit the flowers.' Think of this as a seed, not a gift." I folded the letter, placed it into the envelope, sealed it, and wrote her name across the front, Lily Whitlow, keeper of the small light. When Lily arrived, twilight had just fallen. She knocked as always with 3 soft taps. I opened the door and saw her young face glowing in the last rays of sunlight. "Are you all right?" she asked, still holding her bag of cakes. "I'm fine," I smiled, "and about to be even better." We sat at the table drinking tea, chatting about small things, the neighbor's cat, the library event, how early the dogwoods had bloomed this year. When I handed her the envelope, Lily looked up, eyes wide. What is this?" "A thank you," I said, "but not because of anything you did for me, because you reminded me that I can still believe in someone." She held the envelope, not opening it, just clutching it gently as if afraid to crease it. "You don't need to thank me," she murmured. I interrupted softly, "came and stayed. Sometimes that's enough." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I used to be afraid of being forgotten. But then I met you, and I realized some people don't need to be remembered because they never really disappear." I looked at her, my heart softening. "Then remember this," I said. "If someone ever tries to make you believe your kindness is weakness, read that letter again. It's not meant to praise you, but to remind you." When she left, I stood at the door watching her go. The sunset cast a bronze glow over her hair, and for the first time in years, I felt I had truly completed a circle, not of power but of faith. I closed the door, leaned against the wall, feeling light, as if I'd finally set down a long-carried weight. On the table was Lily's teacup, still warm, the steam faint but lingering like the quiet trace of genuine presence. I thought, if B were still here, she would smile and say her favorite line, "The world doesn't need more winners. It needs people who keep their promises." I looked up at the photo of the 2 of us on the shelf, the light tilting across the frame, and whispered, "I did it, B." If you've ever felt like your kindness went unnoticed, remember, someone always sees it, even if it's just one person. And sometimes, one person is enough to begin again. Leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to catch the final chapter of Begin Again Stories, because some letters aren't written to say goodbye, but to remind us that trust still has a place to bloom. Early the next morning, Savannah was covered in a thin layer of mist, like a forgotten wool shawl draped over the steps. I woke early, brewed mint tea, and sat by the window as the first light touched the cream-colored wall. A sparrow tapped lightly on the eaves, and I realized that for the first time in months, the house was completely still. No more calls from lawyers, no more threatening letters, no more heavy footsteps across the floor. It was just me, the steam of tea, and the silence of someone who had walked through the storm and no longer feared the rain. On the table was Lily's teacup from yesterday, a faint trace of lipstick on the rim like a gentle memory. I touched the envelope she had left behind. She had written a few lines after going home, in purple ink. "You taught me that kindness doesn't mean silence. I'll keep that for life." I smiled, feeling as though B had just winked at me from her picture on the wall. I stood, opened the window, and let the wind sweep in, carrying the scent of damp earth, ripe oranges from the backyard, and the smell of an ordinary morning I once thought would never return. At this age, I no longer needed anyone to validate justice, because true justice doesn't live in a courtroom. It lives in the first night you sleep peacefully without having to justify yourself. I walked onto the porch, holding my teacup, and sat down on the wooden chair Bea had painted back in 2002. The paint had peeled on the armrest, but the chair remained steady, just like how we had steadied each other through difficult seasons. I opened a new journal, its first page still blank, and wrote the first line. Today I'm not starting over. I'm simply continuing, but this time with myself. I paused, listening to the distant sound of the river running through the city, the church bells striking 8, and the rustling wind that felt like a late blessing. I no longer felt bitterness inside me, only a gentle emptiness, like the space left behind after a blade has been removed and the scar has already healed. I thought of Caleb not with anger, but with the hope that he would learn no one truly wins by trading blood for advantage. I thought of Miles, hoping he would keep his promise to live differently. And I thought of Lily, the one who would write the rest of her life without repeating the mistakes of those before her. Everything had returned to its place, as if time itself had patiently pieced the fragments back together, waiting only for me to sit still long enough to see it whole. I set down my cup and took a long breath. There was no more smoke, only warmth. No more victory, only truth. I knew I had fulfilled my promise to keep the light, even if only a single flicker remained. As sunlight rose across the trees, I heard myself whisper, "Everything's all right." The words weren't meant for anyone, but they echoed clearly in my chest, light yet deep, like the sound of a door closing gently after a lifetime of storms. If this story touched you, leave a note telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to follow the next journey of Begin Again stories. Because sometimes happiness doesn't come from starting over, but from the moment you sit down, pour yourself a cup of tea, and realize you're awake, and you're still here.